Assalamualaikum and hi. In this video, we're going to talk about learning in psychology. But first of all, I'm Akmal.
I'm Lukman.
I am Anas. You can call me Bob.
Okay, learning in psychology has three basic types. The first one is
classical conditioning.
and the second one is operant conditioning.
And the third one is cognitive theory learning, or we call as observational learning.
Basically, psychology is a scientific studies about mental process and human behavior. So, learning in psychologists often define that learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior as a result of experience. The psychology of learning focuses on a range of topics related to how people learn and interact with their environment. Learning also can be defined in many ways, but most psychologists would agree that it's a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience. During the first half of 20th century, the school of thought known as Behaviorism rose to dominate psychology and sought to explain in the learning process. There are three major types of behavior learning. The first one is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a natural stimulus that associated with a natural response. Later I will explain more about classical conditioning. The second one is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a response that increase or decrease due to reinforcement or punishment. And the third one is observational learning. Observational learning is a kind of learning that occurs through observation and imitation of others. So we go to the first method of classical conditioning. So we go to the first method of learning, which is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs when two stimuli are paired together repeatedly. The first stimuli evokes a natural response by the subject while the second doesn't. But after enough pairing together, the second becomes conditioned, causes to the response to happen. Yeah, makes sense. Still. So, there was a Russian scientist named Ivan Pavlov, and he discovered this by accident. He kept the dog in the lab so he could study their digestive processes. But now, the dogs naturally salivate to food. He surgically implanted these devices in the dog's mouth so that he could measure their saliva. But experiment after experiment, Pavlov noticed that before the food was even presented, the dogs began salivating. They salivated to the sound of researchers' footsteps or even just to the bowl itself. And the Pavlov was like, wait, the dogs are associating the researchers' footsteps or the bowl with food. The footstep and the bowl have been classically conditioned to evoke the drooling response. After Pavlov found this out, he thought to himself, you know what? I'm going to classically condition a dog's saliva to a bell. That's very useful for some reason. First, the dogs naturally salivate to food. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. The dog drooling is the unconditioned response. The sound of the bell is natural stimulus because dogs don't naturally salivate to that. Pavlov presented the sound of the bell and the food together over and over again. After a number of experiments, he just rang the bell, and you know what? The dog salivated to the sound of the bell alone. So, this is the basic of classical conditioning, which is the first one is natural stimulus. Natural stimulus is a stimulus that does not give any reflex. The second one is unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that causes involuntary reflex. And the third one is unconditioned response. So unconditioned response is basically a natural reflex. And the fourth one is unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that becomes able to produce a learned reflex response by being paired with the original unconditioned stimulus. And the last one is conditioned response. Conditioned response is a learned reflex response to a conditioned stimulus.
Alright, let's move on to operant conditioning. E.L. Thorndike is known for the beginning of operant conditioning, but the famous opinion was accepted by B.F. Skinner. But first, what is operant conditioning? Operant conditioning is a type of learning which is organism learn through its consequences of its behavior. B.F. Skinner made an experiment named Skinner box. The Skinner box device contains a box. In it was a rat, a bull, and a lever. And outside of the box was attached a closed dispenser. Being a rat, it doesn't know how the box functions. The rat moved around the box. It accidentally hit the lever. Then, the bowl was filled with food from the dispenser, and the rat eats the food as it was. After a long time, the rat realized the more he eats the lever, the more food will come, and he learns every time he hit the lever, he gets food. Now let's break down the operant conditioning. The operant conditioning divided by two. The first one is reinforcement, and the second one is punishment. And furthermore, the two divided have two categories, which is the positive and the negative. The reinforcement in operant conditioning is something that strengthens the behaviour of the subject. And the positive reinforcement means something pleasant is added to the stimulus. And in the case of the rats in the Skinner box, the food was the positive stimulus to the rats. So what is the operant conditioning in real life? For me, during the elementary school, if I get A in a test, I got a ringgit from my parents. Then the desired behaviour, which is get A in every test, and the addition pleasant stimulus is get a ringgit. The reinforcement also comes with negative side. This means that the removal of unpleasant stimulus. Back to my story, when I was in school, I had to memorize a CFA. If I not memorize CFA, my teacher will keep nagging on me. So, to stop her to nagging me, I have to memorize CFA. Then desired behaviour is I have to memorize CFA, and the unpleasant removal is she will not nagging me more. Operant conditioning also include punishment. Punishment works as to reduce a behaviour. A positive punishment, an unpleasant stimulus is added to the subject. For example of negative punishment, take Ali and Abu. Ali tell Abu not to touch a cactus, but Abu disobey Ali, so Abu touch a cactus. Then Abu feel pain in his hand. In this case, a desired behaviour is do not touch the cactus, and the addition of unpleasant stimulus is pain from touch the cactus. Next, negative punishment. Negative punishment is removal of pleasant stimulus. For example, if a kid does a really bad thing, their parent will take their phone away. Then the desired behaviour is stop doing bad things, and the removal of pleasant stimulus is phones gets taken away. Okay, that's all for me for operant conditioning. Now we move to cognitive learning.
Hi everyone, I am in here and today I am going to talk to you about the cognitive learning theory and a two-step process within the theory which I guarantee will enable teachers of grade scale through 5 to greatly enhance their student learning ability. First, let me start off by telling you a little about the cognitive learning theory, which states that learning requires cognition or the influence of an organism through processes. Well, the theory is relatively new, became very popular in experimental psychology in 1990s. The study of cognition has been around for a long time. Staff psychologists, meaning an organized rule in German, were at the forefront of cognitive psychology study with great interest how the human mind tried to force a pattern on stimuli in the world around a person. In particular, Gesell psychologists Edward Tolman and Wolfgang Kohler, as well as monopsychologist Martin Seligman, had highly influential cognitive learning theory that we know and use today. We start with the first process in a cognitive learning founded by Edward Tolman. He set up a month-long experiment in which created a maze and put 3 separate groups of mouse in the maze at different times in order to figure how long it would take them to learn the maze and escape based on the presence of a stimulus, in the case food. The first group of mouse received food every time they managed to find their way out. The second group only received food on the 10th day instead of every time they managed to escape. In the third group, the control never received any food, no matter how many times they escaped. Tolman found that the second group of mouse who only received food on 10th day were still able to immediately find their way out of maze. Once food became present, but tended to wander aimlessly in the absence of food. Tolman then came to the realization the mouse had formed a cognitive map of the maze, which they would use in the presence of food, otherwise they would just wander around because they had no incentive to escape. He called this latent learning because of the mouse abilities. Immediately, the mouse escaped from the maze when there was an incentive of wander around aimlessly when were one using this experiment. As an example, teachers can greatly enhance their student ability to learn without having to reinforce them every time. For instance, if a teacher were to give a student a good star for every 10 books that he or she reads, then that student will have an incentive to read 10 books instead for reading just one, expecting a good start afterward. How observational learning it works. Psychologist Albert Bandura is the researcher perhaps most often identified with learning through observation. He and other researchers have demonstrated that we are naturally inclined to engage in observational learning. In fact, children as young as 21 days old have been shown to imitate facial expression and mouth movement. If you ever made face at an infant and watched them try to mimic your funny expressions, then you certainly understand how observational learning can be such a powerful force even from a very young age. Bandura's social learning theory stresses the importance of observational learning. In his famous Bobodol experiment, Bandura demonstrated that young children would imitate the violent and aggressive actions of an adult model. In the experiment, children observed a film in which an adult repeatedly ate a lunch. After viewing the film clip, children were allowed to play in a room with a real Bobo doll, just like the one they saw in the film. What Bandura found was that children were more likely to imitate the adult violence actions. when the adult either received no consequences or when the adult was actually rewarded for their violent actions. Children who saw film clips in which the adult was punished for this aggressive behavior were less likely to repeat the behaviors later on. None.
So, here is a few fun facts related to learning in psychology. Forgotten memories are still alive. We have all had that feeling when we can't remember something we thought we knew. We assume the memory has just gone and has been replaced with something more recent and useful to us. The American Psychologist Journal details experiments showing that memories that have long been inaccessible can be revived. The experiments have shown that much like the physical phenomenon of muscle memory, these forgotten memories cannot only be reaccessed but can be learned more quickly and easily than new information.
Recalling memories change them. This is a bad news for an expert eyewitness. Research by neuroscientist Daniela Schiller has shown that the simple act of recalling a memory can actually change the memory. For example, a simple act of recalling something from your past, say a specific birthday present you bought for somebody years ago, weakens other related memories. Psychologists say that this phenomenon allows people to actively reconstruct past memories. People unaware they are creating these inaccurate memories. It can lead to the creation of false memories and can even support the development of irrational fears. It could be argued that we essentially create your own past to serve your own needs and future self-identity.
Learning environment is highly important to learning performance. If you have ever heard anyone discussing a strange ritual they perform in order to try and learn something, then it turns out they might be on to something. It has been shown that learning depends heavily on where, how, whom you are with and what's around you. If you have ever heard one of those days when nothing is sinking in, then try changing the environment around you. Researchers at the University of Sydney showed that learning is heavily dependent on context and that it's more difficult to learn and retain new knowledge when it is out of context. So, for example, if you are learning about nature, then your learning and memory creation will be far better if you are in a natural environment. Learning about nature set into would be more difficult as it would be out of context.
Learning capacity is limited. This might seem extremely obvious, but classrooms around the world generally ignore this fact. Creation of new information by the brain can be very difficult, especially when it is not linked to any relevant information already stored. The capacity to process brand new bits of information is limited and requires a great deal of attention. In order for learning capacity not to become overloaded and significantly deteriorated, it is important that teaching is well prepared. This means ensuring it is not overwhelming, it is engaging, and that new information is connected to old information in a coherent and meaningful way.
The first one, human behavior and attitude can be changed if the right techniques and ways are being implemented. It doesn't matter whether they are used to such behaviors ever since childhood because someone taught them behave a certain way, or sometimes they may have zero clue about it. There are always be solutions to nurture and curb the problem.
So what can I conclude for my topic discussion in point of psychology is operant conditioning can be applied in several ways. When an instructor has the ability to knowledge between what best suit the student, whether in regards of reinforcement, punishment or other factors, they have a path to reach him or her and success in learning skills and ideas. Thus, its application can enhance these environments and student knowledge, and is a fantastic tool for education.
Lastly, what can I get from this topic? Learning is a change in an individual's behaviour that is semi-permanent. An individual is capable of learning by watching other individuals. 5 elements of behaviour are associated with learning. Through learning, performance can result from potential behaviour to specific behaviour.